What's going on, guys? This is Empty Box, and today I'm going to attempt to answer the question, why is oval racing so popular in the United States? It's also worth mentioning that some of the reasons are also reasons as to why oval racing enjoys greater popularity in other portions of the world as well, such as Australia. There's definitely some parallels between the two. Now, before we begin, first off, let's go ahead and ditch the NASCAR redneck stereotype. Yes, it may exist for a reason, however, that is not the root cause of America's love of oval racing. That is, at the end of the day, a symptom of America's love of oval racing. And at the end of the day, every sport, every form of racing has that fan. Let's also ditch the idea that road racing isn't popular here in the United States, relative, of course, because, quote unquote, they just don't get it. Oval racing is not this monolithic entity that it is today until really quite recently. In fact, even in the 90s, road racing, in IndyCar and kart, which is a different subject altogether, was incredibly popular. Sports car throughout the 80s with the IMSA series was very popular. Road racing is not foreign to Americans. It's not too complicated. There's just very good reasons as to why oval racing is so popular here today. So let's start by turning back the clock. Racing may have been started 5 minutes after the first automobile was built, but in those days racing was obviously much different than what it is today. These were the days when the Model T was still king. Cars were still faster than the newfangled flying machines known as airplanes, and I'm pretty sure at the time several scientists thought that any man who dared to break 100 miles per hour would simply spontaneously combust. Good times. On one hand, you had what ended up being known as road racing. We all get this. It's there, It's called road racing because they were racing on roads, and that's pretty self-explanatory. On the other hand, we had the seeds of what would end up becoming oval racing as we know it today. Somewhere, a true real man of genius must have decided, what if we just, add really steep banking, get rid of all the extraneous corners that we don't really need, and we can go really, really, really fast. That'll be sweet! While perhaps not fitting the modern image of what we now know as a oval racetrack, tracks like Brooklands, Avis, and Monza served much the same purpose as Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the incredibly dangerous board tracks that had sprung up across the United States. At these places, men did unheard of speeds for the time, staring death in the face while abusing their teeny tiny little tires for all they were worth in the cars and motorcycles of the time. It was as much racing as a test of endurance as it was land speed racing for the time. Of course, it certainly had to be spectacular as well as spectacularly dangerous. And of course, when there's danger and spectacularness involved, as well as pushing the absolute limits of how fast a thing can go, naturally there was an attraction. This is where oval racing really stems from. It was not out of, well, let's just make it really super simple so that way the uneducated rednecks can figure it out because the right turns are really confusing to them. But instead, let's just go ahead and crank it to 11 and just go really stupid fast. As I'm sure you guys can figure out, anyone who has been on the internet and has heard someone say, America, can probably figure out that this is the kind of stuff that we like doing. It's something in the water, I guess. I don't know. Along with the rise of auto racing came an interest in participating and spectating. This required tracks, obviously, which is where the snowball begins to start rolling. Thankfully, well, depending on whether or not you like oval racing or not, many former horse racing tracks were converted rather simply over to auto racing. They were already built and worked just fine for the day. It was a perfect fit. On top of that, all across the country were local fairgrounds where there was already land available to build a small little track and race cars on, as well as race horses and hold concerts and events and things like that. It is no coincidence that many of the oldest tracks in this country are either former horse racing tracks or are built on fairgrounds. However, auto racing wasn't that popular. Certainly not enough that we needed to have 72 billion short ovals like we do today. But there was a big factor in why we have so many of these tiny little tracks, and that is population density. Simply put, outside of the Northeast and California, the United States is a very big country with not that many people in it. Well, relatively, of course. This meant that outside of those specific regions, auto racing had to be really cheap to survive. The track had to be cheap to build and maintain because you couldn't ever expect to have thousands upon thousands of fans show up because there probably weren't even thousands upon thousands of people in the area, let alone people actually interested in watching cars race. Not to mention, the races need to be cheap enough to attend for the spectator to remain a viable form of entertainment, as well as exciting enough to keep them come back and getting them interested. The cars needed to be cheap to race because the track owner, who was making next to no money, well, he didn't have a lot of money to just throw out as prize money, so you can't race really expensive cars. It's all got to work out. Thankfully, because of the needs of this country, the cars existed. Due to the wide expanses that have created this lack of population density problem in this country, the glorious V8-powered automobiles that were created to travel and to sell in this country, well, they were perfect for oval racing. They had large, big, chunky V8s in them, and they were prevalent. It basically made for good, cheap horsepower. The cars were perfect to race on these oval tracks. The tracks were perfect for the drivers because they needed to be able to race somewhere to become bigger names and move on to larger events, as well as the spectators and promoters. You know, the race were local, it was easy, it was something that could sell and make money, and here we are today, still turning left. In many ways, it really was the central and southeast regions of the United States where oval racing truly thrived. It was as much of a conscious decision as it was a simple necessity because in these portions of the country, road racing was not sustainable. There was simply no way to actually get people to the tracks and therefore make money, so that way the drivers would drive more expensive, fancier, faster cars and get that whole snowball rolling. The Indy 500 firmly established its fan base in the Midwest and points to the east, while in the southeast you had what has now become the NASCAR juggernaut. Really, the top two series in North American auto racing, and NASCAR and IndyCar, are largely regional products that have just happened to have, over the years, a wider, more national reach, sometimes better than others. To sort of illustrate this point regarding how spread out this country is and how big of a problem it is, as many of you guys will know, I'm from Iowa. For those of you guys who are international viewers, I basically live like right in middle of the country, more or less. A little bit north of center, but not by much. But the nearest road course that is capable of hosting a professional level event. There are certainly circuits that are closer that are capable of hosting club level events. However, people don't go to club level events, and that's why those tracks will never grow into more well-known circuits, and why they haven't, because many of them have been around for years. But the closest circuit to me is Road America. It's still 4.5 hours away. Road America is also 2.5 hours north of Chicago, according to Google. It's in the middle of nowhere. This kind of got me thinking about another circuit that I had heard was in the middle of nowhere, and that was one of the reasons why Formula One had to end up leaving it, supposedly, in Magny-Cours, the former host of the French Grand Prix. It was said to be in the middle of nowhere, so nobody showed up apparently, and it failed, and that's that, supposedly. At least that's what they say. But that track is only 2.5 hours outside of Paris driving distance. Europe, your version of middle of nowhere is totally, entirely different than the middle of nowhere that we have here in the United States. Even the historic home of Formula One here in the United States, Watkins Glen, one of the most well-known circuits in this country, is still 4 hours away from New York City. Between a lot of the road courses in this country being literally in the middle of nowhere and far away from people, and then some road courses, for example, Bridgehampton and Riverside, being all too close to people and therefore getting run out of town, unfortunately, it's not difficult to see why, even though in the 50s and 60s and 70s the United States had a somewhat rich road racing history and had established itself to the point where nobody would thought 40 years later Mario Andretti would be the last American Formula One world champion, it's just played out that way. It really is a relatively recent thing that oval racing has become so defining of American motorsports. Yes, in many ways it had already become the identity of American motorsports, but not really to the same degree that it is today, where it is so identifiable. Frankly, I put that more down to the rapid decline of open-wheel racing here in North America as a whole in the 90s, but as pretty much everyone on this channel has ever heard from me when I utter the word karts, well, you know where that's going, and that's a different story for a different time. And I just want to leave you with one last tidbit. It's certainly worth pointing out that NASCAR can trace its roots back to the moonshiners, the guys running alcohol illegally, running from the cops. They were road racers, first and foremost. Hope you guys enjoyed. Bye.